I am in State College, Pennsylvania.
Okay, excellent.
Where are you?
I'm actually in Italy at the moment,
Ah, very nice.
which is it's very sunny outside. So I had to close the curtain. But we really appreciate your time for this. So I know you've only got about 40 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah. So, yep. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we're if I can just make a very quick introduction to EarthOrg. EarthOrg is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies, for the protection of the natural environment, and an extension of governance and oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org Talks, we're engaging with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinion and knowledge with our global audience, also all to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. So a very huge welcome to Dr. MichaelE.Mann, distinguished professor of atmospheric science and director of the Earth System Science Center at Pennsylvania State University. Prolific and highly followed author whose most recent book is The New Climate War, published in January 2021. In your book, you chart how the fossil fuel industry, lobbyists, and political actors mostly aligned with the political right have for the past 30 years deflected the blame for climate change, using a whole host of pretty insidious methods to generally mess with society's ability to respond sensibly to the threat of dangerous climate change. In the words of former Vice President Al Gore about your book, MichaelE.Mann skillfully explains the complicated dynamics of global warming and vividly portrays the sophisticated and coordinated campaign by polluters to block the policies and solutions needed to solve the climate crisis. And most importantly, he proposes a path forward that is both realistic and optimistic and should inspire readers to take action. I understand you wrote the book whilst in Sydney, sitting out the pandemic. Do you think that politicians of the world have learned to listen to the scientists?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's good to be with you. And yes, I did spend a sabbatical down under in Australia when they were experiencing what has come to be known as the Black Summer, which we all read about. We all saw those images. They are seared in our brain, unprecedented bushfires that spread out across the continent, which really laid bare, in my view, the reality of climate change. This isn't a far off threat. It's here now, impacting us, and the impacts will get much worse if we fail to act. That's the urgency, but there's also the agency part of the equation. There is still time to act. And indeed, as you allude to, I do think that both some of these profound extreme weather events, like we saw play out in Australia, combined with the pandemic, really have raised awareness. I think they have taught us a lesson about our fragility on this planet. And I think it has provided an opportunity for having a larger conversation about basic issues of sustainability, but at the same time, I think it has also helped spur concern and awareness and action in dealing with the climate crisis.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It was absolutely hellish, the images that came from Australia. On that point, do you think the human race is sleepwalking its way to a kind of hell on earth?
Well, we have been. And again, I think that's where the pandemic, to extend that metaphor, I hope it sort of awakened us to the reality of the multiple crises that we face as a species on this planet. And of course, none is more profound than the climate crisis. So we learned some basic lessons, I think, for example, about the dangers of anti-science, of science denial, of ideologically driven science denial. We can measure the toll of that science denialism in hundreds of thousands of human lives here in the United States that were needlessly lost because of a president who essentially denied that we had a problem, encouraged people to take actions that conflicted with what public health officials, what scientists were saying. And so that's the deadliness of anti-science, of ideologically driven attacks on science that might prove inconvenient to powerful special interests, vested interests. We saw that with the pandemic, but I think it teaches us a lesson as well about the climate crisis. And so all of these things have come together: a global pandemic, sort of the acute impacts of climate change that we are now seeing play out, and a favorable shift in the political winds here in the United States when it comes to climate action, which I think has larger ramifications for the global effort to deal with the climate crisis. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we are emerging from that slumber, and that we are, recognizing the challenge we face in the nick of time. We don't have much time left to act, but we have recognized that we need to act now.
Absolutely. I think many of us were very pleased to come out of that sort of dark age that we were in for those 4 or 5 years. And let's hope, as you said, that the new political situation, it leads to a lot better progress. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit later on. And fascinating section of the book is the light that you shed on some of the methods of deflection, where vested interest promoting individual responsibility is the solution, deliberately to deflect concerted action by policymakers, such as the fascinating story behind the famous Crying Indian campaign from the 1970s. Can you cite some direct equivalents today?
Yeah, in fact, there was a study that just came out yesterday. It got a fair amount of media attention. It was by a colleague of mine, Naomi Oreskes, and a co-author of hers, actually documenting how ExxonMobil has shifted in the framing and the language that they're using as the impacts of climate change become clear and they can no longer deny climate change is happening. They're trying to deflect attention, and they go through sort of their entire history of advertising and messaging and showing how they have selectively tried to encourage a frame in the media discourse about climate change that directs attention towards individual responsibility and away from corporate culpability and the need for policy and systemic change. And that is indeed a major theme of my book, of the new climate war, so-called deflection campaigns, like the Crying Indian advertisement that you mentioned in the early 70s, which was actually an effort by the beverage industry to deflect attention from bottle bills that were starting to pass in the various states, a regulatory approach to dealing with the problem. They didn't want to see that happen because it would hurt them, their bottom line. It would force them to process the returned bottles and cans. It would hurt their profits. So instead, they engaged in a massive disinformation campaign. And many of us were taken in by it. We thought that it was sort of this empowering effort to raise awareness about pollution, but it was really an effort to direct attention to individual responsibility at the expense of systemic actions that would actually do something meaningful about the problem. And today, one of our other great global environmental crises, of course, is the plastic pollution crisis. And we have the beverage industry to thank for that. As you allude to, the fossil fuel industry has taken that playbook. They're running with it. There's a reason that BP, British Petroleum, gave us the first carbon footprint calculator in the early 2000s, because they wanted us so focused on our carbon footprint that we failed to notice theirs. 70% of global carbon emissions come from just 100 polluters.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. I think one also suspects, some of the campaigns that encourage, put the blame on individuals as we grow up. There were actually industries behind it lobbying. I think it's something we can all look back on our childhood and wonder about.
But we feel like we've lost some of that innocence, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that climate change has begun to transcend political and ideological boundaries and become a more universally recognized existential threat?
Yeah, at some level, I do. I think that, at least we see in the United States a move from conservatives away from outright denial. That having been said, they haven't given up. They're still, by and large, doing the bidding of fossil fuel interests of polluters when it comes to the politics and when it comes to their discussion of policy solutions. Republicans like to talk about techno fixes. Oh, we can geoengineer our way out of the problem. We'll just shoot particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sunlight. Anything but solving the problem at its at its source, which is our ongoing addiction to fossil fuels, because they're so beholden to the fossil fuel industry. And so they've moved on from denial, but by and large, conservatives in the US are still using these frames, these various tactics that I describe in the New Climate War: deflection, division, doom mongering, anything that prevents us from taking the action necessary. We see that here in the United States. We see that in countries like Australia under the conservative government of Scott Morrison. And so we're making progress. I think that we've seen some real progress over the past several months, but we're not out of the woods yet. There are still obstacles in our way. And a big part of this book is raising awareness among readers about what those obstacles are, because these tactics are more insidious than the old climate war, which was just outright denial of the science and the impacts. It was easy to see, it was easy to spot, it was easy to call out. These tactics are more insidious. And that's really what the book is about, recognizing them, because they are really all that now stand in our way.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it absolutely fascinating, I must say. In the book, you use these phrases: inactivists, doomism. How have inactivists spread climate doomism, as you call it in the book, and why is this just as bad as climate denialism?
Yeah, it's really, it's a complicated topic, and it's easy to lose important nuance when we talk about it, because we have to recognize that they're people of good intention, good faith, good-hearted people who have fallen into despair. They are victims. They're not the enemy. And it's very important to recognize that. We have all, I think, have friends and family or colleagues, who have fallen into sort of climate despair. They're convinced it's too late to do anything about the problem. And that's not true. The problem is those promoting that frame sort of at the top. And there is quite a bit of evidence now that there are some bad actors that have indeed promoted that frame, because they recognize that, if you don't feel you have any agency in doing anything about the problem, it potentially leads you down the same path of inaction as outright denial. And some of the sort of narratives that are put forward by some of these bad actors are that, we're undergoing runaway warming. There's nothing we can do about it. All life is going to be extinct on the planet within 10 years. And by the way, that particular prophecy was put forward 5 years ago. So I guess it means we have 5 years left now. Put that on your calendar.
Mm-hmm.
There is no scientific evidence to support that kind of stuff. And often it's based on the distortion, for example, of Arctic methane, which is a factor. As we warm the Arctic, some of the methane that was trapped in the permafrost, as it thaws, that methane is released into the atmosphere. It's what we call positive feedback. It adds to the warming, but it doesn't cause runaway warming. And this idea that it's too late to stop, civilization ending warming is premised on bad science, and it is used by bad actors. Especially we see this on social media, where bot armies and trolls, some of them seem to be connected to state actors like Russia, who have been trying to sow discord about climate action. Vladimir Putin has made it pretty clear that he sees Russia, their biggest asset right now are the fossil fuels still buried beneath the ground, and they want to monetize those assets. And so Vladimir Putin and Russia have engaged in sort of cyber ops aimed at defeating climate action around the world, in Canada, in Australia, in the US, in France. But I think one of the examples that really crystallized this best, and it came out after the book, just a couple months ago, there was an op-ed by a conservative politician, Mitch Daniels, who was the former governor of Indiana, and a conservative, a Republican who has in the past denied the science of climate change and denied that action is necessary. He wrote an op-ed in, I believe it was USA Today, where he actually said that if we believe those climate models these scientists are using, it's too late to stop the warming. So here we very clearly saw the telegraphing of that sort of framing and talking point by a conservative who's opposed to action. But often it's much more subtle than that. It's hidden. It's not really out in the open. It's bad actors, malevolent actors in social media trying to sort of foment doom and division and anything else that will prevent us from acting.
Yeah, I mean, from reading the book, what became quite clear is that, I mean, certainly in the West, at the top levels, there seems to be quite a small number of people that could be, identified as being these bad actors.
Yeah.
You mentioned some families, you mentioned the Koch family, the Mercer family, the Murdochs. I mean, their names come up again and again, and
Yeah.
in some cases they're so powerful that these are like Bond baddies, basically. They're
it's
really
remarkable, isn't it? Just a handful of people in the world who are by and large responsible for the predicament that we're in now.
Yeah, it's quite incredible, and something that we'll have to see in the future. Do you ever think there's a case for creating a climate climate crime in the future? Do you think this is something that may come along?
Well, we saw efforts here in the United States to bring bad actors to justice when it came to the tobacco industry and their efforts to hide the deadly, impact of their product. And there was a settlement by a number of states' attorneys general with various tobacco companies over that. But they were forced to testify under oath, and they committed perjury. These various tobacco CEOs, I think some of us still remember that scene where they perjured themselves by claiming that they didn't know about the deadly impacts of their product. So, you have some of the same litigants, some of the same attorneys general and litigants in that case have said they see exactly the same thing right now with the fossil fuel industry. You could make the same arguments for an anti-racketeering case, RICO case, as we call it in the United States, basically fraudulently keeping critical information from your stockholders, which is a crime, but more importantly, in this case, from the public at large. So I think a case can be made. And in fact, I have argued in the past that what we're talking about here is actually even greater than a crime against humanity. This is a crime against the planet. It's something bigger. And I do think that those who knowingly took part in a deliberate effort to mislead the public and policymakers about this existential crisis do need to be brought to justice. And as they say, the gears of justice turn slowly, but I think we're starting to see some efforts to hold them accountable. And yes, maybe it does ultimately come to the point where the World Court actually considers punitive actions against individuals and organizations that took part in this.
Yeah, it would be, I think, a fantastic development to see crimes against humanity, crimes against the climate, crimes against the earth, be considered in the same way at The Hague. Let's see. That might be something that perhaps my children see. Let's hope so. I wonder, do you think that people are more naturally inclined to react more positively to messages that changing their own lifestyles and behavior can make a difference? Do you think this is enough?
Yeah, so this is, and this is part of that crying Indian ad, deflecting attention away from, the systemic solutions that are needed. And the fossil fuel industry has been doing that. That doesn't mean, by the way, and I think that this sort of, get your question gets at this, doesn't mean that we shouldn't do those things, right? We should all, try to be the best stewards of this, earth that we can be. We should all try to minimize our environmental impact and take part in actions that decrease our carbon footprint, our environmental footprint writ large. Many of these things make us healthier. They save us money. They make us feel better. They set a good example for other people. There's sort of no regrets actions that we ought to be taking anyways. What we can't allow is for bad actors to somehow make it seem like that's all that's necessary. It's just about individual action and accountability, because ultimately, and there's some studies that now show this, that really can lead to a decrease in support, in fact, for the systemic actions, the policies that are necessary. Because make no mistake about it, neither you nor put a price on carbon ourselves, or provide subsidies for the renewable energy industry, or fuel infrastructure. We can't do those things. We need our politicians to do that. And that means, using all the lever arms of the policymaking apparatus that are available to us, voting so that we vote in climate advocates, those who are willing to do something about the problem, rather than those who are just willing apologists for the fossil fuel industry. We can make a difference. We can use our individual voices and our individual actions, including collective actions like voting, to affect policy change. So these things are interlinked.
You had a fantastic section on tipping points, and it seems to me that right now not quite enough people are using their energy to clamor for use that vote, clamor for systemic change at the government level, to the more radical and systemic adjustments that are needed by government and business. This tipping point, do you feel as though there does seem to be evidence, but what are your thoughts on whether we're approaching a tipping point at which there's a very big swing in public opinion?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we are approaching it. I think there have been a number of precipitating events, the wildfires that we've seen play out in Australia, here in the United States, unprecedented storm seasons here in the US, withering heat waves and droughts and wildfires and floods and around the world. It's raised public awareness about the problem. We have a youth climate movement that has helped recenter this conversation away from just being about science and economics and policy and politics, recentering it on ethics, on our ethical obligation not to, ruin this planet for future generations. That's helped recenter the conversation. A global pandemic that has laid bare, as I said before, the dangers of ignoring what scientists are telling us about the threats that we face, about the crises we face, whether it's the pandemic or the climate crisis. And it's taught us lessons about our fragility on this planet. And then, the final ingredient here is a favorable shift in the political winds, where we've gone from having a denier in chief, a president in the United States who essentially worked to sabotage global efforts to act on the climate crisis, to a president in Joe Biden, who's now leading on this issue, who has gone forward with a very bold agenda in the opening months of his presidency, has appointed, John Kerry as the special envoy on climate for the United States. Kerry helped, negotiate some of these important policy developments back in the Obama years. All of that comes together, to place us in the most favorable position we've been in. And then finally, that intersects with a global, or let's say at least in the United States, a reckoning when it comes to basic questions of justice, racial justice, cultural justice. All of that is in the mix. And I think it is sort of a perfect storm, if you'll forgive the pun, of consequences, of factors that do place us very close to that tipping point on climate action. I think we can all feel that we're very close at this point.
Yeah, I think to some extent the youth have definitely put that mirror up to the adult generation. I think that's really been an incredibly effective surprise that was really gathering momentum in 2019, and I think it's only really for COVID that there's kind of been a bit of a pause, and I really hope that also gets going again, post COVID. So I think we'll spend a little bit more time on the US a little bit later on. But in the meantime, I've got a couple more questions. Have the inactivists uncovered better or at least more effective ways of engaging with the public than climate scientists, campaigners, and activists? Is there something strangely seductive about an inactivist's message?
Well, no question about it. I mean, their messaging is focus grouped. They have some of the leading pollsters Their talking points are all focus group tested. They work. They know that they work. There's a lot of money behind their, public relations efforts, and it shows. They have been very adept at, misdirection, at deflection, at division, all of these things that we're talking about. That having been said, scientists and advocates for climate action have a secret weapon on their side. It's called truth. And call me, old-fashioned, but I still think that matters in the end, even in this age of alternative facts and fake news. I do think that truth in the end makes a difference, and that people still have the ability. They need a lot of help, and they need help by messengers, the climate, advocacy community. But people can see through that, and they're starting to see through that. And we see the desperation. We see the desperation in the form of ever more shrill talking points and tactics as the critics, as the sort of enemy, if you will, the inactivists become more shrill in their messaging. It's telling you that they see the writing on the wall. And I think that's where we are. I do think we're going to prevail in this war. I think the forces of good, of action are going to prevail, but we still have battles ahead. Make no mistake about it. The other side is still very well funded, very well organized, and very effective in their messaging. The good news is climate advocates have now started to get, really to do the same thing that polluters had done for decades, work closely with communication experts and messaging experts to hone our own messaging. And for example, Frank Luntz, a Republican pollster, who infamously was advising the fossil fuel industry and Republicans on ways to, game the language to prevent climate action, from denying that there's a scientific consensus, or using more soothing terminology in the way they framed that. That's what Frank Luntz was doing 2 decades ago, helping polluters with their messaging. More recently, Frank Luntz has apologized for doing that, and he's now working with Democrats in the United States to help them with their messaging. He doesn't want to be on the wrong side of history. And I think there are a lot of folks like that. They ultimately, in the end, don't want to be on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's exactly the phrase I was going to mention next. It seems, and I hope that it seems, that increasingly, if you're standing on the wrong side of the line, you don't want to be the last person there. And
Right.
And
that plays into the tipping point phenomena that we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's super interesting. The technosaverism. I know this is a favorite. I mean, I myself, I love technology, but I think yes, it can be overplayed in terms of what's needed to be done. There's no doubt that some of the changes that are going to be needed, will be painful. How do you think these can be sold to the wider public? So if there is systemic change, if there is a carbon price, if there is other changes to behavior that need to be kind of effectively directed / imposed by government, in the future, how do you think there's going to be a way to sell this?
Yeah. So, and I think it's important. Again, all of these topics we're talking about are far more nuanced than our conversations about them generally do justice to. And it's nice to be able to have a long form conversation about this and to get into some of those nuances with you. Obviously, technology is important. Technological innovation is essential, and it will assist us, in this effort. But it's like anything, too much of something often is a bad thing, too much of a good thing. Technological innovation is a good thing, but convincing the public that that's all we need, that it's the entire solution, is for many reasons. The first reason is simply we have the technology now. We have, in the form of renewable energy, existing storage capacity. We have the technology now to solve this problem, to decarbonize our society, our civilization. And there are numerous studies by leading experts, Stanford, UC Berkeley, elsewhere, that demonstrate that. And so it's unhelpful when someone like Bill Gates, who has his own book on climate change out right now, says something like, we need a miracle. He's on record saying we need a miracle, that we're going to need magic technology to solve this problem. That's misguided. We don't need a miracle. We've got it now. We have the technology to decarbonize our civilization. What we need is the political will. And again, Bill Gates has said, in interviews that he doesn't know the solution to the politics of climate change. Well, if you don't know the solution to the politics, then you don't know the solution to the problem, because it is about politics now. Yes, technology will make it easier. Technological innovation, economies of scale, what we call learning by doing. As we start to implement these technologies, we discover new efficiencies. That's all important, but it's not a reason for saying, hey, 10 years from now, we'll be able to solve this problem. So, trust us. In the meantime, we're going to just keep burning carbon because we've got this solution that we're going to take care of it later. Trust us. That is really dangerous reasoning and argumentation. And it is what we're seeing from some of the bad actors, this idea that technology will save us, so we don't need to stop polluting now. That's just wrong. We need to stop, we need to solve this problem at its source. We need to stop adding carbon pollution to the atmosphere now, using existing technology to shift us away from fossil fuels, recognizing that down the road, there will be new technologies that'll make the task even easier. But that doesn't mean that we don't act now and we don't move forward with everything we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, geoengineering, carbon capture, natural gas. Geoengineering just terrifies me, I have to say. And carbon capture, yeah, and carbon capture. You've mentioned in the book that these are really non-solution solutions. Do you think they ever had a place? Were they ever part of the solution 30 years ago, perhaps, or was it always wrong-headed to think this way?
Yeah, and again, I distinguish a bit between the different types of geoengineering interventions that are being discussed. Some of them scare the heck out of me, just like they scare you.
Yeah.
Shooting, sulfate, aerosols into the stratosphere to try to block out the sunlight, to cool the planet back down. This sort of cover up. It's not solving the problem at source. It's just trying to cover it up. And
it's
that,
like putting sun cream on after you've got burnt.
Absolutely. And it is rife with potential unintended consequences. In fact, the modeling exercises that have been done by some of my colleagues actually show how dangerous this really could be. But the most dangerous thing is the moral hazard. And we already alluded to this idea that, hey, we'll be able to engineer our way out of this problem. Trust us. We're developing the technology. We're going to deploy it. So let us continue to burn fossil fuels now. We call that moral hazard. It's a license to continue making the problem worse with the promise that we'll somehow be able to solve it. And we could very well find ourselves in a situation where it's too late to do anything. And there's a recognition that these so-called solutions aren't viable or they're too dangerous. And so that still applies for what we might view as some of the more inert geoengineering solutions, like direct air capture, sucking the carbon back out of the atmosphere. In a sense, it's trying to solve the problem, which is the carbon pollution, but you're trying to get the genie back in the bottle. And if you watched Aladdin, you know that that's not easy to do. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's not easy to get it back in there. Once the carbon is in the atmosphere, it's a lot more difficult to take it back out. It's expensive. And it's a lot cheaper not putting it into the atmosphere in the first place, because in fact, moving to renewable energy will create more jobs. It'll grow the economy. So it's just crazy that we're talking about these sort of technologies that allow us to stay addicted to fossil fuels further into the future when we have a much safer solution. It may be a solution that is politically inconvenient to some powerful interests, polluters and those promoting their agenda, but it's the only safe strategy to address this problem. Get away from the burning of fossil fuels and the adding of carbon pollution to the atmosphere.
Yeah, and as soon as possible. looking at the US, the prospect in the future of a return of the Republicans, let's hope it's some way off. But is there any chance of the Republicans adopting market-based solutions to climate change into their mainstream, policy proposals anytime soon? And if so, do you see little sparks of hope there?
Yeah, so and I sort of allude to that in the concluding chapter of the book. That if we're going to see climate legislation, most likely, just given the prevailing politics here, there is going to be a need to win over some moderate Republicans. And that's become pretty clear, even though Democrats nominally control Congress. It's a 50-50 split Senate with a vice president, a Democratic vice president who breaks that tie vote. So Democrats are in control by the slimmest of possible margins. And that means there's no room for error. It means you can't lose any Democrats. And we've got some coal state Democrats like Manchin of West Virginia, for example, who have made it very clear that they would not support anything as bold as, say, AOC's, New Green Deal, Ed Markey's New Green Deal, the sort of version of the New Green Deal that's been advocated by some progressive politicians. There probably won't be the votes to pass that, even by what's known as reconciliation, a process that allows you to win with just a majority, avoiding that 60-vote filibuster that Republicans use to block the legislation. So it remains to be seen what path Democrats, pursue. Are they going to try to move really bold climate legislation through the Senate in the hope that they can keep all of those Democrats, somehow win over Manchin and Sinema of Arizona, two of the holdouts? Or are they going to target maybe a dozen moderate Republicans who, getting back to what we were saying before, don't want to be seen as having been on the wrong side of history? And I do feel that there's some good faith Republicans who want to be on the right side of history when it comes to this issue. They recognize it's real. They recognize it's a crisis. They're really worried right now about the fraught politics of the Republican Party and the way that the party sort of that the sort of those who currently appear to have power in the Republican Party, the sort of Trump sympathists, the way that they'll turn on any, Republicans that don't move in lockstep with them. So I think there's a lot of fear, and I think we're going to need to see some evolution right now in our domestic politics before there will be that room for good faith Republicans to come over. But I think ultimately meaningful climate legislation probably will take compromise that can win over some moderate conservatives. It'll involve market mechanisms like carbon pricing, which some moderate conservatives have indicated they could get behind. We are going to need legislation to complement the executive actions that the Biden administration has taken to codify that, to give it some staying power. And so we'll just have to see. But I suspect we might see some sort of compromise climate legislation. I would just add one last point here. We did see nearly every Republican in the Senate vote for a stimulus, an emergency stimulus plan, just as Biden took office, that included $35 billion for, get this, green energy. Those were Republicans by almost almost every Republican supported that. So it is possible.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. Let's hope so. And let's hope there's chances of cooperation in a gridlocked political system.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm covering some of the similar ground, and hopefully you've got a few more minutes, if that's okay.
Sure thing.
Just a couple more questions. That's great. I mean, touching on this, on what you're thinking of Biden's early months in office, and in terms of his domestic climate policies and ambitions for reducing emissions. Biden seems to have a plan. Is it the right plan? It seems to be no carbon price. Never seems to quite make it in there. What are your thoughts on this generally?
Yeah, and there's a limit to what an executive can do. For example, if we're going to see carbon pricing, there's no question we need congressional legislation. to codify that. The government can sort of use its own carbon pricing internally in how it evaluates various policies, and they do. There's a price on carbon that is used to make policy within the EPA. And that was one of the battles during the Trump years. They tried to eliminate that or at least knock it down. The lower that price on carbon, the less driven you are to engage in climate friendly policy based on the sort of the decision-making apparatus within the EPA. So carbon pricing writ large, then you're going to need legislation to codify that. And so I think there's probably a recognition on the part of the Biden administration that those sorts of mechanisms are going to need to happen in the legislative branch. That doesn't mean that the president can't be lobbying for them. And you're absolutely right that in the plan that they've put forward, they haven't talked as much about the importance of carbon pricing as I would like to see. They're in the current plan, and I think that the plan, the Biden plan, is the boldest plan we've seen yet on climate. And he has put forward a pledge to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years, which is exactly what we need to do if we're to avert catastrophic warming. And by the United States putting that out there, it starts to put pressure on some other intransigent actors like Australia, who thus far have not shown a meaningful commitment under their Prime Minister, their conservative Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to really do support meaningful climate action. So I think that's changing the dynamics, globally. And that's really important. The United States being a leader once again and bringing other actors. And we've seen that already, the United States and China negotiating an agreement to both step up their efforts, the 2 largest polluters on the planet. That sort of puts pressure on the other nations of the world. So that's all really good. But it doesn't mean, just because it's a laudable effort on the part of the administration, doesn't mean that we can't sort of question some of the specifics. The lack of, much discussion of carbon pricing, I would point to. I would also point to the language that seems to provide at least an opening for geoengineering and nuclear, which I think is a risky strategy forward. I don't think we need it. I think it's more dangerous and more expensive than the alternatives, renewable energy. So there's language about nuclear, about geoengineering, potentially supportive of those sorts of actions. And there's support for coal or natural gas, mainly coal and natural gas with carbon sequestration. The idea, well, if they can capture the carbon and not let it into the atmosphere, then they're not contributing to the problem. Well, actually, that's not true, because even the very best carbon capture is imperfect. You're still allowing a fair amount of carbon to leak into the atmosphere. By most estimates, probably 30% in most of the efforts that we've seen thus far, leakage rates of about 30%. So you're still allowing a lot of carbon pollution into the atmosphere, and you're adding expense. And at a time when on a levelized basis, renewable energy is cheaper than these other, than nuclear, cheaper than natural gas. If you're talking about then requiring carbon capture, well, that's just going to make natural gas and coal even more expensive. And they're already more expensive on a levelized basis with renewable energy. The only thing that's kept them alive are government subsidies that artificially make them a cheaper alternative. So I would like to see, those are some of the areas where I think there is room for strengthening the plan, but I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. This is the best, boldest plan that we've seen of any American president, including Barack Obama. That's to be lauded, even as we work, hopefully, to actually improve things a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely feels a lot better than a few years ago, and very much even from this side of the Atlantic, we're looking positively on what Biden is attempting to do with Kerry and the rest of the team. I think something that's quite interesting that seems to be rising is a logic which suggests, and Dieter Helm has put this forward in his latest book, that perhaps some unilateral action, and it looks like the EU is using this language where they create a carbon price within their bloc, and then they institute border adjustment taxes, and they
Yeah.
say, hey, if you want to trade with the EU, you will collect a tax unless you do.
Yeah.
And it could be something that might create a domino effect amongst the big trading blocs, that
Yep.
they want to domesticize that tax collection, and that could be in a way an effective way of introducing carbon pricing without a kind of a big, very complex global deal. Well, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think we want to micromanage how different countries effectively end up pricing carbon into their decision making. There are lots of different ways to do that. I don't see it as my role to prescribe how that should be done. In the United States, should it be a carbon tax? Should it be tradable emissions? Are there ways to do this potentially, or the equivalent thereof, through renewable energy standards, minimum renewable energy standards? There are lots of ways to try to do that. And so, I think we need to leave it to governments to figure out what works best for them. But you're absolutely right. What ultimately does have to happen is that those countries that are unwilling to step up need to feel the pressure. And one of the way pressure, of course, is through things like tariffs and border adjustments. The Biden administration is talking about that. Australia was starting to run scared when there was a suggestion that, if Australia doesn't get their act in gear, we might be ultimately imposing some border adjustments on their imports. So, yeah, I think that's a really important tool that we have, that we can leverage at the international level to, in addition to sort of name and shame, which is, those countries that refuse to act will, become pariahs at some level. You do need something with a little more teeth in it as well. And I think that border adjustments and tariffs are a good potential way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I believe so too. I think the complexity of a global deal, and on that question, perhaps it's just one of my closing questions. In fact, is what are your views on the realistic outcomes of COP26? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm pretty optimistic here. I think because the United States has sort of laid down the gauntlet. The Biden administration has put out a really bold commitment, a pledge to step up our Paris obligations quite a bit. So we'll see what China comes forward with now, because we did see, John Kerry negotiated this deal with China, the details of which we don't really know yet. But what we heard, at least in terms of the public facing part of it, was that there was a commitment on the part of both nations to take meaningful actions. The United States has laid down their cards. Let's wait to see what China does, because once China and the US, their pledges are on the table, that puts huge pressure on everyone else, including some intransigent actors. Europe has moved forward with a very bold plan. The UK has moved forward with a very bold plan. A lot of countries are stepping up their commitments in a way that's, that is cause for optimism. That by the time we reach COP26, we will have on the table, some meaningful ratcheting up from the countries of the world of their initial Paris commitments, because we know we need that, right? The current commitments maybe get us halfway to where we need to be to limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we need to step up those commitments quite a bit. The United States looking good, Europe, UK looking good. Let's see what China comes forward with. Then let's see as other countries come in. But I think it was very useful for Joe Biden to have that virtual climate summit on Earth Day here, last month in April here in the United States, bringing various heads of state together to sort of make sure that we start, that we take stock now, so that by the time later this year we get to we get to Glasgow, COP26, we'll be able to, to codify a real meaningful upgrade of the Paris Agreement.
Yes, I hope so. I think what's been really stark for everyone, even someone not particularly knowledgeable, with what's happening, really is the pace of these announcements. So suddenly, cutting the UK banning petrol cars from 10 years time, 50% reduction. it's really accelerated.
Who would have guessed that from Boris Johnson,
Yeah.
4 years ago? It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And worldwide, let's see, in Asia, where EarthOrg is based, we're obviously quite close to what's happening in China and Japan. We do see, very quite strong statements, and I think to some extent, as you said, there's a slight vying for leadership on this subject, and we all hope, I think, that the US, steps back up to take the lead in this kind of vital, critical area of policy.
Now we're seeing peer pressure playing a role. The IPCC calls this name and shame. That was sort of the enforcement mechanism behind Paris, and it's actually working. It really does make a difference. Once some start leading, it does put this political pressure on others to step up. And so I'm with you. I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe we're going through that tipping point, and when we get to Glasgow later this year, we're going to see more cause for hope, more cause for optimism that we're acting in time to avert truly catastrophic climate change.
Excellent. Michael, Dr. MichaelE.Mann, thank you very much indeed. It's just been fascinating speaking to you. Your book, The New Climate War, is a fantastic read. I recommend it to everyone, and we very much appreciate your time speaking with me this afternoon.
Thank you. It was great talking with you. Look forward to talking again.
Thank you. I'll stop the video. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's absolutely wonderful. It's been just fascinating to speak with you personally. I'm a huge admirer and
thank you.
On many of your positions. So I founded EarthOrg. It's a very small. We've got a great domain name. We're a small team, but big ambitions to make a difference in this area. And one of the things we do is all the content, with the website publishing, with the data science work that we do, building an audience, but also trying to build an audience amongst thinkers, amongst leaders. We sort of favor systemic change. So we're an organization that believes that governments do need to take action. This is something which we're only going to get there. We're only going to get to the level of change that we need it if it's effectively government directed. And so we're really trying to engage and activate that political passion in people to use their vote where they can. Of course, in China, that's not possible, but where they can, to use their vote to make a difference. And anything that we can do, is part of that mission. So
you're preaching to the choir. That's all, from it's very much my view on all this as well. So well, let me know when this will go live on the website at some point, or what's the
so we'll create we'll add the sort of answers to the book review, so that will be done as an article. There would be a sort of a transcript of the interview put as an interview, kind of in long form, just as it is. And then the video will go onto YouTube in its full length. And there'll probably be short segments that'll go onto social media.
Well, great. I'll do everything I can to help get out the word. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's amazing. Thank you. And in the future, Michael, I know you're extremely busy, man, but I'd love to invite you to, if you ever wanted to write an op-ed, we'd be very, very pleased to publish it on EarthOrg. And we've recently spoken to Anatol Levin, to Jonathan Porritt, to Jason Hickel, Dieter Helm. We'll if you'd like to feel as though an op-ed or there's some subject that you'd want to write about, then
understood.
We'd love to work you on that.
Sounds great. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you very much. All the best. All the best. Bye. Have a good weekend. Bye now.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.